Buhlebenkosi Mhlanga, who is the director, Mission Minded Foundation, and the founder and chair lady of an organization called Girl Grandeur in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, which focuses on helping the underprivileged and abused women and children through different forms and measures. She has many years of working experience with different organizations, and currently she is working on creating institutions and support groups to enable peace, justice, and equality within her community, which is a long-term program that will see many benefiting from it, regardless of age, race, color, or ethnicity. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you for your session, Achieving the Impossible. Can we be SDG16 believers?
Hello, everyone. My name is Buhle. I'm from Zimbabwe under an organization called Mission Minded Foundation. I am the director and founder. So today my presentation is on SDG16, Achieving the Impossible. Can we be SDG16 believers? I'll start off with the quote. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. For the first time, the international community, through their endorsement of Sustainable Development Goals 16, have set out a shared vision of the central role effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions play in enabling sustainable development. This goal is not only important in our own rights, but also contributes to the wider delivery of the United Nations Agenda, 2030 Agenda. Peace, inclusion, and the delivery of basic services all rest on the effective and accountable management of power. There is then a need to look at the trajectory for achieving Sustainable Development Goal 16 and focus on how development cooperation providers and other actors can better support developing countries to achieve this goal. While the challenges of achieving these goals are stark, given current rates of progress across most countries, there is no reason for defeatism. In order to speed up progress and change trajectories, the development community needs to focus more on those factors that can either positively or negatively influence the speed of progress on governance reform. Hence, there is need to identify a few points: the political settlement, economic growth, the quality of international assistance, and the presence of external incentives and global norms. Capitalizing on these factors, however, will require many development actors to radically change their practice, not just jargon, and genuinely do things they have not done before. Concluding by identifying 4 big shifts that development cooperation providers can make in order to accelerate progress towards SDG 16. And these are 2. Act politically, innovate radically, measure effectively, collaborate differently. SDG 16 is something that we have not had before, not just within the Millennium Development Goals, but within development. Agreement on the role of institutions is rare, particularly one that provides a basis for an agenda of action amongst all stakeholders. The novelty factor is heightened because this is no drab vision of institutions, but one that touches centrally on the connection between the structures of power and the people that they should serve. As a result, SDG is more than simply a normative agenda, and equally, it is more than just technical capacity building. It lays out the central role for institutions encompassing both function and their ethos logically, puts politics at their hearts. At the heart of institutions. SDG 16, with the emphasis on inclusion and accountability, recognizes that it is the nexus of politics and institutions that shape directions of travel. Put simply, the strategies followed by those who dominate the political settlement in using or neglecting institutions impact greatly on development outcomes. On these twin pillars of institutions and politics rest the prospects for stability, economic growth, and the ability to deliver on the expectations of ordinary citizens. It is not surprising that the World We Want project under the UN for Sustainable Development Goal process found that expectations of a more proactive role of governments come together with expectations of a greater accountability of governments. Deficits in governance are seen as a hindering inclusive growth by squandering resources needed for development. SDG16, with emphasis on both whether institutions work and how they work, captures these challenges of ethos and capacity. I want to touch on sustainable development goals and the targets. Firstly, we want to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. That being said, we are just going to quickly run it down. So number one, significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. When I mean everywhere, I mean globally. Number two, end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against torture of children. Number three, promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. 4, by 2030, significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, and combat all forms of organized crime. Number 5, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all forms. Number 6, develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. Number 7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. Number 7, broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in institutions of global governance. Number 9, by 2030, provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. Number 10, ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. That being said, we're going to bring it down again. Strengthen relevant national institutions, including through international cooperation for building capacity at all levels, in particular developing countries, to prevent violence and combat terrorism and crime. Promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. As I continue, the importance of SDG16 begs a question of how difficult it will be to achieve. Measuring progress towards achieving the proposed goal and targets is problematic. But anyway, as I go down, right, there is a wealth of governance-related data produced by both multilateral organizations and NGOs. The data does suggest some positive long-term trends on individual areas within the goal, but here the phrase long-term is important. There are also a significant number of states that remain substantial distance away from achieving the overall goal. The world we want mentioned above signals that large numbers of people view their national and local institutions as falling below the line or lines. Rates of progress are therefore the central question in determining prospects for achieving this goal. The assess progress on the quality of institutions, we need to turn to assessments that aggregate information over time and seek to look for trends within countries as well as between them. Across the goal, we see that as with 16.4, there are no safe, easily achievable targets. Realistically, when they take a face value, the challenges of institutional reform and practical delivery within SDG16 are great. In addition, these targets are not themselves a linear path to overall goal. Only targets 16.6 and 16.7, the points that I mentioned above, covering capacity and accountability and participation, arguably have a causal link to the overall aim. As a result, stakeholders must work to deliver the targets while keeping a careful eye on the horizon to maintain a route towards the goal itself. And then I also would like to mention something here. SDG16 is also important, but extremely difficult to meet by 2030 on current trajectories. However, rather than admit defeat, supporters of SDG16 need to focus on potential drivers or inhibitors of change in the area of governance. So here, the next section, I will highlight the 5 factors that can either enhance or slow down the governance reform. We've got political paths to SDG16. Perhaps the single biggest factor that impacts on the rate of change in governance reforms in countries is politics. All institutions operate within the context of politics, and any hope of progress rests within the political arena. The political dimension includes issues both of the political settlement and also in relation to social constituencies and public engagement. For the former, the overused term political will is a misnomer. The real nexus between politics and institutions is often rooted in the actual opinions available to those who dominate political settlements in their management of power. We've also got the international assistance supporting a reform. Politics may arguably be the primarily variable, but there are also other factors that influence events. These other variables include some that offer building blocks for those supporting SDG16. For example, while the role of external actors is limited, it can play a part. There are signs that those countries receiving support for institutional reform can perform better than those who don't. Arguments over casualty are acute whenever governance funding is linked directly to institutional change, yet undertaken by the World Bank's project to develop the indicators of strength of public management systems. The ISPMS did provide some encouraging signs. We've got external incentives. In addition to external assistance, another influence on degrees of change are incentives. Incentives can take many forms amongst them, albeit less pronounced among less development countries is accession, in quotes. International ambition characterized by accession programs for trade blocs or global bodies has an important pull effect. The WGI measure for effective governance suggests that on the whole, periods of accession have been important for entrance and aspirants to the AU. While AU accession may be a compelling but geographically limited driver of change, it does underline the border principle that very large carrots can have an impact. And then we've got global norms. In addition, global norms combined with facilitators such as access to media also act as variables by challenging levels of expectation. Norms rewrite domestic definitions of what effective or accountable can mean, altering the balance of the dynamic between politics, institutions, and social constituencies. SDG16 itself reflects a transnationalization of expectations around institutions and follows in a tradition that has arguably proven its worth. And then we've got economic growth and the rise of demanding middle class. Another key factor that has the potential to drive governance reform is economic growth and the rise, and the rise of a demanding middle class growth. As Nancy Bedsole has said, the theory in short is a key benefit of the middle class. Is that a key benefit of the middle class is a greater likelihood of good politics and good governance, what is often called in the development community good governance. A benefit that is not inevitable, but if the middle class is large enough compared to the poorer and the rich, is more probable than otherwise. However, there is a need for caution. A growing middle class does not inherently equate to a progressive social constituency. Pressing for the attributes of SDG16. Middle class growth is a powerful element in changing trajectories of institutional development, but without growth for both capacity and inclusion can also precipitate these episodes of crisis. As a result, when trying to nudge political engagement for progress on SDG16, the combined ethos of the goal, capacity, and inclusion are equally important, including in encouraging broad-based coalitions for change. And then we've got the 4 essential shifts for changing trajectories. If wide-ranging domestic and international stakeholders such as civil societies, multilateral organizations, other providers of development, finance, and social actors are to have an impact, then arguably they will need to make the most of opportunities to positively build on these factors. For some, particularly formal development organizations, this probably means changing ways of working. SDG16 is one of those rare instances where the adage, no more business as usual, cannot be a cliche if development cooperation providers, in particular, carry on as they are, then they will fail. Instead, SDG16 calls for leaps of change. I would argue that these leaps encompass 4 big shifts, though not magic bullets. They offer the prospect for more effective engagements with the factors mentioned above and are within the scope of stakeholders. There are things that can be done and potentially provide means to amplify the impact of coalition and advocates for SDG16. Number 1, we've got act politically. Where politics are the problem, not the engine of reform, how can and should stakeholders engage? How can dominant political actors be persuaded that managing power works best through institutions that are not effective but accountable? In theory, development has become a far more politically informed sector. In practice, however, being politically informed is not the same as engaging actively with political barriers and opportunities. Today, development cooperation providers do increasingly undertake political economy analysis in order to better understand the countries and sectors in which they work. However, despite investing in analysis, providers rarely use this to implement a political strategy for influencing change. Increasingly, this gap between political analysis and more political approach is becoming untenable, as aid accounts for a declining proportion of development finance. The influence of its providers, including many NGOs, is likely to decline. Stakeholders by choice or necessity must therefore learn the art of influence as they seek to shape policy debates from less provided positions using advocacy rather than conditional approaches. This shift requires donors to link their political analysis to the active use of political engagement to secure the change. This includes a willingness to see formal development organizations as only part of a wider collection of stakeholders, most importantly, including social constituencies seeking change and reform from communities and civil societies. It is broad-based national coalitions for SDG16 that may have the greatest effect on politics. We've got number 2, innovate radically. When political space for institutional development does open up the external support, has the scope to become a multiplier and accelerator of change. This is true for NGOs and domestic civil society, but it is also an issue that providers of development finance must consider. Innovation in development assistance for constitutional change inevitably requires a review of traditional technical assistance focused models. It also, however, requires exploitation of new instruments and programming approaches. Most notably, the example of incentive-based change needs greater attention. Perhaps the strongest incentive has been accession, but there are others. The type of performance-based budgeting work undertaken in local government, pioneered by the UNCDF, also underlines the role of that incentives can play. These more results-focused approaches point to the potential for donors to place control over institutional reform resources in the hands of states themselves while creating the incentives for change. Number 3, measure effectively. Measuring institutional progress is a long-standing problem. The World Bank paper, well, after having gone through it a bit, it outlines the needs for ISPMS, called for measures that capacitated the change within structures, not just for outputs, the arguable casualty. The problem is accurately capture the changes of behavior, ethos, process, and efficiency that represent real institutional capacity development. As a result, development has a myriad of governance-related indicators of variable quality emphasis. Most of these indicators rely heavily on perception-based approaches, often the easiest form of information to gather, but one thing that brings its own set of problems. Perception surveys normally pick up on outward-facing issues rather than overall effectiveness. For example, petty corruption rather than its grand sibling. I'd like you to have a look at Anderson and Haywood 2009. This can skew understandings of dynamics and focus attention on the interface of a problem rather than its structural roots. Like perception studies, other approaches, including experience surveys and administrative measures, have their strengths but also weakness. Administrative measures, for example, are at the risk of being gamed, or face problems of casualty and quality variation. This approach can ground truth, the narrative of the goals and real progress. If budget outturns point to progress, but a stronger measure says not, then pressure for real change and real outcomes for citizens can be sustained. The challenge is that those triangulating measures will need to reflect the strongest of the many indicators currently around, while looking seriously at new approaches that overcome the issues of casualty to show the quality with which institutions can convert their inputs into services for citizens. Last but not least, collaborate differently. SDG16 cannot be delivered by any single community or group. National governments have the greatest impact, but many actors will be important in making a leap forward to achieve the goal. The question is whether those actors will enhance the capacity of each other's efforts or dissipate impact through incoherent approaches. The challenges set out above call for an where more voices can help. Equally, innovation is external support. Suggests greater attention to mutually leveraging the impact of either programs or new instruments, and an ability to measure that will require diverse access to information. Put simply, the logic of maximizing the variables, meaning ending the hubris of development sectors and group in order to recognize the new alliances, in order to recognize that new alliances are needed. Part of this alliance building will need to revolve around strengthening momentum of the SDGs as a whole, and SDG16 in particular. Individual constituencies will need to make a leap of faith that SDG16 can become a movement with real momentum and throw their weight into making that happen. In their first years, it was not assured that the MDGs would gain traction as a catalyst for effort, taking hold gradually over time. Given the scale of challenge, SDG16 could conceivably be written off if an investment of commitment is not forthcoming from stakeholders. Nurturing this through a big tent conversation, and encouraging a movement for SDG16 is arguably an important role for UN bodies. Increasingly, alliances will need to mobilize different types of voice in common cause, a particularly acute need for development actors recognizing the role of aid within a change context of wider development finance. Alliances and collaborations will therefore be essential to any contribution towards progress. David Stephen has suggested that to achieve SDG16 in this time frame, we need to be in a high-speed train, but actually we are in a donkey cart. And so the task is to change our carts into a train. Perhaps the starting point for this process are steps to build these far wider and more fluid collaborative initiatives among stakeholders, working as partners to reach out to the governments and political actors. Even if the high-speed train does not deliver, the whole goal is to remain, it remains the case that getting as close to the destination as possible will make a difference in the constituencies that matter the most. The communities globally who have voiced their call for institutions that work inclusively and accountably. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bhule, for the informative session. Thank you for joining us today in the summit. you.